Hello! Today we will be interviewing LacksCreativity, the writer of A Cloudy Path. Welcome, Lax. How did you discover Worm?
I genuinely can't remember. I know it was in late 2013, and I started reading just as Worm was wrapping up. I finished the story a day or two after the last epilogue chapter was posted. But how I actually found it in the first place? Not a clue. Now, that said, I know exactly how I got in the Worm fanfic community. Before Worm, I generally wasn't interested in fanfiction. I read a little bit way back in my high school days, in the late 90s. But not very much, and I didn't stick with it. Normally I'm a rapid media consumer, and I don't tend to get too deep into things. Just read/watch/play, then move on to the next thing. Mostly reading. It wasn't unusual for me to read a book every day or two back when I was younger, and I think it's a fairly conservative estimate to say that I've read around 5,000 books in my life. With Worm though, pretty much for the first time, I wasn't ready to be done with it when I finished reading. So I spent a while rereading parts, going through the comments, which I'd originally ignored as I binged, and Googling around for commentary and discussion. Which led me to someone mentioning Retuhugi's Here Be Dragons, Taylor, Lung Power Swap, for those not aware. I read it over Christmas at my mom's place in 2013, what there was of the fic at the time, and from there moved on to SB in general. That led me to other fics, and the ideas thread, and I consumed all of it in pretty short order. After that I still wasn't ready to be done with Worm, so the only option was to try writing my own fic, which I started in April of 2014. I'd never written anything before, barring high school writing projects and various tabletop modules, but like I said, I wasn't ready to be done with Worm yet. Still not, really.
Here Be Dragons. That's a throwback. You often have such insightful commentary on characterization and canon versus fanon debates. Is it just because you've reread canon enough, or do you just have such clear images of how characters act?
I think that reading Worm multiple times is certainly part of it. I've done 3 full read-throughs at this point, and I've gone through the story looking for details many times more. So I think it's fair to say I'm pretty familiar with the story in general. Beyond that, I tend to give a lot of attention to the characters' personalities when I'm reading a story. Power levels, technology, magic systems, world building, all that stuff is fun, but it's not what I read for. I like characters, especially ones that are consistently portrayed and interestingly developed. Worm, needless to say, has them in spades, and their interactions are probably what hooked me on the story most. Twig, for those that haven't read it, has the same thing going. Beyond that, though, I've just been in the fandom for a while. I've had time to see fanon rise and fall, read dozens of different discussions about every aspect of the story, and come to my own conclusions about things. That said, I'm hardly a real authority. Even now I'm coming upon facts that I haven't noticed before, often pointed out by Red Tom. If anyone other than Wildbow is an authority on Worm, it's him, or seeing something I believe get debunked or corrected. Which is probably part of why I'm still so enamored of Worm. With most settings I feel like 3 years of intense scrutiny would have revealed everything there was to know, and yet here I am, 3 years into my Worm kick, still learning stuff.
What was your favorite part of Worm?
The S9 arc. The behemoth fight is a close second, especially with the immediate lead-in chapters. Drone 23.4 is probably my standout for best single chapter, if I had to choose one. I think that both arcs highlight Taylor's growth up to their respective points in the story, in both positive and negative ways, while also pushing her rapidly forward. They're both tense, dirty, and utterly desperate struggles, and they both have some genuinely heart-wrenching moments. The losses suffered, and the consequences of those losses, carry forward in big ways for the rest of this story. Neither arc really defines Taylor, and I couldn't point to a single element of either that served as a true turning point, but Worm doesn't really have those. There's no one arc, chapter, or line that I can point to and say yeah, that right there is what made Taylor, Taylor. It's a much slower, continual process. Both the S9 arc and the Behemoth fight were significant contributors, of course, but what they really did for me was to highlight what had already been happening over the course of the story. They put it in stark relief, both the bad and the good, and brought it all together as she tried to tackle impossible odds, and failed.
That's very insightful. That's very in-depth. Okay, I remember the first few chapters of A Cloudy Path being published, and you've repeatedly asserted that you wanted to stay street level. 20 arcs later, and you've been pretty successful. But given recent progress and Taylor revealing her true specialty, will that be the case, or will a concession need to be made?
It's not so much that I've said I want to stay street level forever or anything, as much as I want the focus to stay on Taylor's personal growth, and the growth of the people around her. Honestly, I think Worm did a decent job of it in a lot of ways, despite the complaints I've seen about the time skip and what happened afterward. Complaints that I don't entirely disagree with, really, but that's another topic. Still, if you look at the chapters after the oil rig fight especially, there's a lot of really great character moments there. Bitch, Imp, Tattletale, Panacea, and Shadowstalker all show off some significant development, and their interactions with Taylor are some of the best in the story. It's just unfortunately bookended by some of the less awesome moments in the story on one hand, and the insanely intense Kepri arc on the other, so it kind of tends to be forgotten. If anything, I'd like to aspire to that level of character writing in the midst of cosmic-level chaos. If and when, emphasis on if, A Cloudy Path ever goes full subcom, those are the sort of moments I'd be aiming for.
Fair enough. Sorry for misunderstanding your intention. What was your favorite thing to write?
Sort of goes with my previous point, but mostly I like the character moments in extreme situations. They're not the easiest things to write, and I'm not sure I could say I enjoy it in the moment, but they're certainly the most satisfying to go back to, and to see what sort of reactions people have. That said, I also like the surprise twists and the wham moments. I won't point out anything specific, but there's a few around Arc 11 and 13 that were especially fun. I suppose it's also worth pointing out fight scenes. Dialogue, descriptions, character building, introspection, story advancing, all that stuff isn't easy for me. I have to work at all of it, in a very deliberate and non-creative way. Those scenes I craft, in the pretty literal meaning of the word. They're work, not art. I build them. Fights are the exact opposite. Every fight scene in ACP is off the cuff, first draft, written in the moment with no planning or preparation. I just get to the point where I need a fight scene, then write it. Generally in one go, without breaks. Normally when writing I tend to manage 500 to 1000 words an hour, if I'm doing well. I can double that for fight scenes, and for a few when I was really on I nearly tripled it. That's a big reason why I was about to release arcs 8 and 19 with a chapter every day. 50k words in a week isn't normally something I can manage, but when 80% of it is fight scenes, it's easy.
Okay. Especially with Supreme Commander Fix, there always seems to be a balance between the econ build-up and the escalation wargames halves. Some people prefer one side to the other, some find the balance to be skewed to one side. Some say that econ is tedious and expository. Where do you stand on this?
At the most basic level, I'd say that execution trumps concept. If you can do it well, then pretty much anything can make an interesting, engaging story. That said, for me at least, characters and their interactions are the main draw of a story. Of course, that doesn't really answer the question. Another way to look at it is through the lens of an actual game of Subcom. In Subcom, a lot of players like to turtle. The build-up and the fighting are two separate elements to them. This works against the AI, less well against the higher-level AI, of course, but against a decent player it'll get you slaughtered. You need to skirmish and harass at least as much as you need to build your econ, and in a good game there's no really sharp divide between build-up and fighting, but instead a steady progression where both are present. Barring an Aku snipe, anyway. That doesn't really answer the question either, I suppose. Moving on.
Uh, dear. Uh, to be fair, it's my fault for asking such a Supreme Chromatic related question, but yeah, fair enough. It's admirable that after all this time, through breaks and long stretches of no updates, you have not only kept up writing, but to the same standard and quality as always. How do you manage this?
I like to finish what I start. That's the main reason, honestly. I think my writing has improved enough, and I've got enough other ideas, that if I wasn't committed to finishing ACP I'd have moved on long ago. Because really, ACP is just a 1.2 million word, currently, writing exercise. I want to get better, and ideally at some point write my own original fiction. Got a decent idea of what I'll do first, too. But if nothing else, I want to have the experience of writing an ending to a story, and some practice at editing, before I start my own works. That's a pretty personal reason, of course, and not terribly helpful to anyone trying to stick with the writing project. But really, it's most of the reason for me. Not a lot else I can say on the matter. Shark.gif and all that.
Fair enough. What's your favorite fanfiction and why?
That's a hard one, in a couple different ways. Partly because I'll inevitably compare all wormfics to Worm, and none of them come off well in the comparison. Another element is that I'm just not reading many fics right now. Not sure why, but I've been steadily losing interest, despite enjoying Worm itself just as much as I ever have. If I had to choose, I'd probably say Wake. Cenotaph was good, and I enjoy Legacy well enough, but Wake is the one I like the most. Best overall quality of any wormfic I've read, and some incredible high points. If nothing else, I've reread it more than any fic besides Here Be Dragons, and that's what got me into the fandom in the first place, so it's a special case.
Okay. Any other recommendations?
I'll never stop recommending Setanta, or at least not until it gets the recognition it deserves. It's a post-canon fic, featuring original characters, doesn't involve Taylor, it's well-written, updates regularly, has an actual engaging story, some excellent post-apocalyptic world-building, and is just generally overall excellent. It hits all the marks that everyone's always asking for, and does some really great, original stuff. And yet it gets basically no attention. It's insane. Read Setanta. Everyone. Maybe you won't like it, because it does have a somewhat shaky start, but at least give it a chance. It's the breath of fresh air that everyone always says they want, and it's been running since April 2015, updating consistently all the while. Way more consistently than I do. More than anyone except Wildbow himself. Yet the readership remains tiny. It's baffling to me. Besides that, Mixing Feelings is great. Other than Setanta, it's pretty much the only thing I'm reading right now. It rambles sometimes, but it's still pretty great, and features a total OC as the protagonist. Suffers from the biggest, but thankfully optional, power testing section I've ever read, though. Now, both of those aside, but really, to read them, my biggest rec is gonna have to be Twig. I never read much of Pact, didn't really grab me, especially reading it update to update. But Twig hooked me, and hooked me hard, if not quite so hard as Worm. Not right away, since it has some issues with the first arc or two, and it took me 2 tries to really get into it. But once I did, it was amazing. The writing quality is even higher than Worm's, and the characters are pretty goddamned incredible. Even if the world building and the story sucked, which they very much don't, the cast and their interactions would pull me along anyway, and I'd still count it among my favorite stories. Cannot say enough good things about Twig.
I would also recommend Twig and Setanta to people. It seems to be a growing theme that Setanta is something that people should read, and so I'll probably do something on that for the future, but for now, thank you very much, Lax, and I'll see you guys next week.